I'd like to focus a little bit more on power. I mentioned it at the top, that these things can have huge amounts of power and they can show the inequality of power. And I just go, one thing that comes to my mind, and you actually mention in your teaching when you do your teaching, is, for example, the 1884 Berlin Conference. How a single stroke of a pen, with these people, these colonial powers in Berlin, decide that this is where the countries of Nigeria and this is where Cameroon's going to be, completely dissecting, the tribes in the Niger Delta area, for example. And that's just one element of how cartography and geography is used as a tool of power. And one thing that I've read quite substantially when I do these kind of things is Painter and Jeffrey. They've got their political geography of 2009, their publication. And they opine that, cartography and even geography, the concept of geography itself, is a tool of colonialisation. And therefore, us as geographers, from your sense and from my sense as a ex-geography teacher, we have to be responsible that we have this innate power because we are teachers and educators of geography. We promote geography. So I really do want to talk about this. So one thing about the book and its structure is something that, because we mentioned atlases and things like that. And the title of your book, of course, is Atlas, is that you give a lot of historical context and preamble and examples at the start of each chapter to tell a narrative before you go into the maps. And one of those things that you look into quite extensively is the work of W.E.B Du Bois. And you seem to, by the way that you write and the stories that you tell from it, you seem to have a lot of affection for Du Bois and his work, as an African-American sociologist and a kind of the activism that he did. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about why you have such affection for Du Bois and his work.
I first kind of discovered Du Bois's work through the resurgence of an interest in the data visualizations that he had created, particularly for this 1900 Paris exposition. And he and his students kind of by hand created these boards, which were then displayed in Paris as part of this big exposition that was happening. And that work has all been kind of digitized, and there's a brilliant book that contains that information. What I hadn't fully appreciated, and this is partly a symptom of the way that sort of sociological teaching is done, and thinking about concepts in sociology and who came up, who came up with them, and the kind of general whitewashing of that history is that Du Bois was a real pioneer in the collection of data about the African American population, particularly in the US. Around the time of the 1900s period. And the power of his work was, for me, and the connection for me, was that he realized that data was being used against people like him because it was predominantly focused on the white population, and it was catering for the white population's needs, and it was being used to create, the horrendous stereotypes and so on that, in the Jim Crow South and things like that were going on. And so, for Du Bois, he realized that data offered power in order to better represent the communities that were not properly represented. He actually, Alden Morris, who wrote a brilliant biography of Du Bois's scholarly work and sees him as a founder of sociological thinking, that's combined, that sort of empirical analysis is actually then combined with a very strong kind of political and politicization of his work, because I think he realized, and he says that data alone was not enough. In fact, he says here, one could not be a cool, calm, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, and so he witnessed and seen, lynchings happening. And he also says that, he assumed that there would be demand for the scientific work that he was doing, but of course he was being, isolated from his work because he was creating hard truths for the people in power. And there's work that he did, what he described as his greatest sociological work, was actually destroyed. I mean, he did this massive survey, and it was destroyed because it was not, considered sort of, in line with the political thinking at the time. And so, he was operating. I mean, he had an incredibly long life. But in the early part of his career, he was operating at a time when there were a lot of other developments. So they were trying to bring in an anti-lynching bill in the best chance they had was around the 1920s. And that was another brilliant example of what we would today consider sort of data journalism. So there's someone called W.E.B Du Bois, and there were others, particularly women's groups, working, collecting data on lynchings and where African Americans had been killed by white mobs. And the argument against legislation was always, this is a local issue. Your local legislators need to stop this. It's not a national issue. So we're going to keep it at arm's length. And the brilliance of their work was demonstrating that it was a national issue and that the maps that they created could be used to articulate that it's a national problem, it needs national legislation, and then they use those maps to try and kind of leverage politicians into voting for an anti-lynching bill. Sadly, they didn't get it through, and even to this, the most shocking thing is to this day there isn't actually any bill in the US that explicitly outlaws lynching. So whilst ultimately they didn't achieve their objective, particularly in the 1920s, which is when they were pushing hardest for this, I think that the mapping and the data collection that was created at the time is incredibly, is both inspirational but also informative in the way that we should go about our work today. And it's not present enough on what we teach from school level, but also through to the kind of university level in map making, cartography, and data visualization and things like that. It's not just that Du Bois created some nice infographics. It's actually the work that went into them to get the robust data collected, the hard graft, in order to create the data sets that could then be visualized.